And then I just started looking into black banks, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is like the most perfect illustration of just racism embedded in the monetary policy and the legal policy of this country, and then repeatedly telling the victims of this entire system of extortion and extraction that if they just worked harder and saved more and stopped buying stuff, that they would have the wealth.
Black banks play a critical role in fighting modern-day systemic racism in the financial sector. Most U.S. banks are community banks, and the same can be said for all black banks in the U.S. Community banks, however, play an important role in supporting communities they serve. For any society, banks are the drivers of wealth creation. And for African Americans, the banking system has had a long history of inequality and betrayal. African Americans have been encouraged by both white and black leaders to depend on these segregated banks to reach collective prosperity. But history shows that African Americans have already done this, and we're still left with nothing. Let's look at the Freedmen's Bank, for example. The North's victory in the Civil War led to nearly 4 million African Americans being freed after hundreds of years of being in bondage. And as freed people, with very little money or resources, they needed a way to generate wealth and establish a savings. In 1865, the federal government chartered the Freedmen's Bank, a community bank meant to help freed slaves transition into capitalism. In 1871, only 6 years later after the abolishment of slavery, 37 branches of the Freedmen's Bank had opened in 17 states. An estimated 70,000 depositors had opened with bank deposits, totaling more than $57 million.
The one flaw, though, is that black folk had no money. This is after the Civil War. There are no reparations. So I've always wondered, you created a bank, well, what do you expect black folk to deposit?
In 1874, after the economic depression of 1873, mismanagement, overexpansion, and outright fraud, the Freedmen's Bank closed. Contrary to what many African Americans were led to believe, the Freedmen's Bank's assets were not protected by the federal government. As a result, only half of the depositors received a payout, which averaged only 3/4 of the value in their accounts, while the other half received nothing. Hopes and dreams for a brighter future were darkened.
The Freedmen's Bank's collapse not only means that black people will not have any of those resources to invest in their future, it also helps to create or animate a distrust in government institutions. So people begin to feel betrayed by the union, by the government, in ways that are going to have lasting effects for generations.
Following the closure of the Freedmen's Bank, there was the Capital Savings Bank, along with a string of other banks that would follow. In the 1950s and 60s, a time when African Americans were denied the most basic of rights, black banks were actually flourishing. Black banking was a symbol of resistance, black power, self-determination, and resistance to white racism. An article by CNBC briefly examines the since decline in black banks. From 2001 to 2018, the number of Black-owned financial institutions declined over 50%. Today, that number is down another 9%, leaving only 21 Black-owned banks in the U.S. Of these 21 banks, not one of those manages assets over $1 billion. The largest Black bank, One United Bank, for example, manages over $650 million, compared to Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and JP Morgan Chase, who each manage well over $1 trillion in assets. African Americans in the U.S. as a collective possess little to no wealth in this country, a country they built, bled, and had to be broken for. But Black economic power and autonomy has always been appealing in the wake of racism and exclusion. Black capitalism was used as a neutralizing communion. Today, Black capitalism has become America's justification for wealth inequality. One United CEO, Cohey, said, "The best way for Americans to support Black wealth creation is simple. Bank Black, even if you're white." Wealth is the sum of resources available to a household at a point in time. Two households can have the same income, but the household with fewer expenses or with more accumulated wealth from past income or inheritances will have more wealth. For now, it is unclear if America truly hopes to heal from the tragedies of slavery and the systemic racism that has followed African Americans, leading us right back to Black banks. If African Americans with very hardly any wealth are to depend on these Black banks for Black wealth developments, for how much longer will Black banks survive? Black and white Americans have had a separate and unequal system of banking. And in the meantime, because of this, Black banks have been a powerless solution to racial inequality and has contributed nothing to closing the racial wealth gap.